I'm gonna need a lot of coffee for this. Mm. Puerto Rican coffee. Hey there, everybody. Glad to see you around here in Historiando again. My name's Dr. Edwin R. I'm a American history PhD. I specialize in Puerto Rico and Caribbean history. Today's subject is YouTube's favorite, one of YouTube's favorite sons, Johnny Harris. Johnny Harris has been doing the rounds. Has been around a lot. I like a lot of Johnny Harris's content. But we're gonna be reacting to his last video, which is titled "How the US Stole Puerto Rico." Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico. Yeah. So let's get to it, huh? Because this is gonna be a long one.
It's easy to forget that the US still has colonies. But we don't actually use the word colony. We prefer words like unincorporated territory or commonwealth. These are places where people are subject to US rule but don't enjoy the full rights that other Americans.
Let me go back to what he was saying regard a little bit.
But we don't actually use the word colony. We prefer words like unincorporated territory.
There we go. Just for reference sake, there's no such thing as Commonwealth status. Puerto Rico is an unincorporated organized territory. It is not a there's no such thing. There is no such thing as a Commonwealth. That is just the name that was given to the government of Puerto Rico. Just like, for example, Virginia is the Commonwealth of Virginia. The word or term Commonwealth has absolutely no legal basis in the U.S. Federal system. So to say that the Mariana Islands are a Commonwealth of the United States, it is the exact same. It's exactly the same as saying that the Mariana Islands are an unincorporated, organized territory. Okay, let's continue.
Or commonwealth. These are places where people are subject to US rule but don't enjoy the full rights that other Americans do. I want to tell you about one of them, Puerto Rico.
And which is the reason why we're here.
When you're in Puerto Rico, you're not just in a vacation paradise, you are in a part of the United States. It feels like the United States, but it also feels distinctly different.
Just like, I don't know, going to Louisiana or going to any other state or going to Hawaii feels different, because each state, each territory has its own culture, Johnny. So the way that things are done, the way that people behave, the way that people local culture develops is completely different, and there's no homogeneous culture in the United States.
This feeling, this limbo state, didn't happen by accident. In fact, it's perhaps the best example of the lengths the United States has gone to hold on to land. So let me show you how the US kept their colony in the Caribbean, using brute force, spying, and the abuse of land and people. This is how the US stole Puerto Rico. Pause the video really quick.
Okay, so I just wanted to give the intro, because I wanted to react to things there. I don't want to react to everything here because, first of all, I don't need Johnny to be saying that I'm basically re-uploading his content, but I just want to say that if you do, I think this is a BetterHelp. Yeah, this is a BetterHelp ad. If you do need, if you as somebody who has gone to therapy, I would recommend anybody to go to therapy if it's not BetterHelp. Just any type of therapy that you need to get better in terms of your mental health. So, mental health is important. So we're just gonna jump up ahead.
Back into Puerto Rico.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's 1898, and the Spanish
Correct.
Empire looks like this. But it's faltering. A lot of its colonies are fighting for independence.
Wait, not a lot of them, just literally two of them from the four that are remaining, which is Guam, Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Two of them are in open rebellion, which is the Philippines and Cuba, which is the reason why the United States decided to start their invasion or their conquest in the Philippines and in Cuba, because they had open rebellions against Spain. Puerto Rico was not at all in an open rebellion, so saying that most of them were fighting for independence at this point in time is not. I wouldn't call it that way. Again, half of them from four. Most would be if Guam was also in rebellion, and there is no rebellion in Guam at this moment.
The United States gets involved and allies with a lot of these independence fighters. They say they want to liberate these colonies, and so they get into the war and they win. But instead of liberating Spain's colonies, they just take them for themselves.
I just want to point out the fact that this.
And one of those colonies was Puerto Rico. And so they get into the war and they win.
This picture of Theodore Roosevelt, of our future President Theodore Roosevelt, and the Rough Riders, I wonder how historically accurate it is, in terms of not what we're seeing, in terms of precisely what we're seeing. You know, it's this is more likely a very glorified version of the charge up San Juan Hill by the Rough Riders. So, but it's interesting. I've always liked it. It's very mythological in that way.
But instead of liberating Spain's colonies, they just take them for themselves. And one of those colonies was Puerto Rico.
Also, I want to point out the fact, and this is props to Johnny's team for research. They're actually showing the spot where the United States started the conquest of Puerto Rico back in 1898, which is going to be celebrated this coming 25th of July, which is Constitution Day in Puerto Rico, but is also the day that we remember a few other events. For example, the beginning of the conquest of the United States of the island of Puerto Rico, but also of the murders of the independence fighters in Cerro Maravilla, the assassination that occurred there, that have nothing to do with directly with the topic that he's gonna be talking about in a few minutes. But it's interesting, and I like it that they're actually showing us the place where I don't know if this is the correct route, but at least it is the area of Guanica. So I just found it. This is the second time I'm watching this video. I found it interesting, and it caught my eye immediately when I saw where they were putting the dashed lines.
Colonies. And so they get into the war and they win. But instead of liberating Spain's colonies, they just take them for themselves. And one of those colonies was Puerto Rico. And so on an ordinary Tuesday in the late 1800s, there was a quiet ceremony that takes place on the governor's balcony.
I want to listen to that again. Hold on, because I'm trying to. There's something in the phrasing that he uses, which is not accurate.
Colonies. And so they get into the war and they win. But instead of liberating Spain's colonies, they just take them for themselves.
Okay, this is where I need to add some things. So, the United States is the victor of the American, Cuban, Hispanic, of the basically the in Spanish would be La Guerra Hispano-Cubano-Americana. So the Hispanic-American, the Hispanic-Cuban-American War, because this war really was started in Cuba. To the victor goes the spoils, right? That would be the way that warfare in the 19th century occurred. Again, history needs to be seen on the lens and the focus of the time that you're actually exploring or investigating. So basically, there is something that I want to emphasize in this area. Cuba was it was ceded to the United States for a very short time, but it was ceded as a protectorate, and then it gains its independence. In terms of Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, they are ceded completely as territories. Philippines would later on become independent, and then you would only have Puerto Rico and Guam in regards of today of the Hispanic American War or the Hispanic Cuban American War results.
And one of those colonies was Puerto Rico. And so on an ordinary Tuesday in the late 1800s, there was a quiet ceremony that takes place on the governor's balcony in San Juan. After 400 years of Spanish rule, Puerto Rico, this island in the Caribbean, is simply passed from one ruler to the next.
Not to contradict what he's saying, I want to add to what he's saying. It might have appeared to be just this nonchalant thing that happened in the island, but in Spain, this was considered to be a tragedy. And there's also in literature there's this entire generation. It's called the generation La Generación del 98, or the 98 generation, where they are basically reacting to the loss of Spain as an imperial power. And it's very interesting the way that Harris is looking at this event versus the way that these writers from the 1900s, early 1900s, were looking at this event. So it's very interesting the comparisons that we can make from the way that an American from the 21st century was creating this video is looking at this event of, the passing of sovereignty from one empire to the other, versus the way that the Spanish would see it.
And this begins an unprecedented experiment in the Caribbean for the United States, an operation to extract resources, money, labor, and military protection from this small, beautiful island. They start by passing a law that gives...
So he doesn't mention the name of the law, so I'm just going to go ahead and give it to you. From 1898 to 1900, Puerto Rico is basically under martial law. So there's a military dictator, military dictator. A military general is the governor of Puerto Rico. And in 1900, Congress approves the Foraker Act, which allows for Puerto Rico to organize a civil government. And obviously the governor is appointed by the President of the United States. And most of the Senate is also, well, it's not the Senate per se, but there's two bodies, two legislative bodies, and one of them is mostly elected, and the other one isn't. But the law he's making the reference here is the Foraker Act.
Gives the U.S. total political control over the island. They start appointing American leaders to govern the island. Men who don't speak Spanish, don't know anything about Puerto Rico or its people. Most of these leaders treat the assignment like a business venture.
some of the interesting, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. He's actually the son of actual, the late president Theodore Roosevelt. Blanton Winship, um, if I'm not mistaken, he's the one. Um, I think he'll talk about it later in the video. He is the one who is during the Ponce massacre and the fighting with the nationalists, and Tugwell, if I'm not mistaken, is the last American to be the governor of Puerto Rico, because after Tugwell comes Piñeiro, which is the first Puerto Rican to be governor of the island. I want to go back a little bit. Um, yes. So these other ones, let me see. This is the Charles Herbert Al is obviously the first civilian American civilian governor of Puerto Rico, and then we see these other ones that, to be honest, they just go. Some of them just come for a small time, and others stay for a few years. But the more important ones are the ones that are mentioned. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Blanton Winship, and Rexford G. Tugwell.
Alignment like a business venture. Like this one guy who, when he was the leader of Puerto Rico, starts to give public Puerto Rican funds to American-owned businesses on the island. Then he stacks the government with American loyalists. And then eventually he resigns, but then he returns to the island to build a sugar kingdom. Now,
You know what's funny? He mentions this as if this is only happening in in Puerto Rico, but if you were to look at the early 1900s, from let's say 1900 to around 1920, during this 20-year period, you're also getting a lot of court cases, particularly the one against Standard Oil. So this is more or less the time where the United States is breaking down these monopolies in the mainland. So what is happening is that these business ventures, they're coming over to the territories, whether this be Puerto Rico, whether this be Guam, uh, the Virgin Islands after the First World War, and they're looking at this based on the court cases that he's going to mention also, which is the casos, the insular cases, the caso insulare, and they are basically doing here what they're not being allowed to do in the United States, which is basically create a monopoly system. Just wanted to add some context into this. Just remember that in history, things just don't happen. There are there's reasons to everything that happens. So in science, there's a law in science that says that there's an equal and opposite reaction. So in Newtonian physics, there's the third law of motion states that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and it also applies to history. So if there's an historical event happening, that event will affect other events, and this is an example. If it weren't because Napoleon Bonaparte and the Napoleon begins the Napoleonic Wars, which is in itself a consequence of both the U.S. Revolution and the French Revolution, South America would not have become independent. And thus, if it's not because what's going on in terms of with Standard Oil and all these robber barons that are being prosecuted by the Roosevelt administration and the Taft administration afterwards, these people wouldn't have come to Puerto Rico.
With the help of all of the political officials that he had appointed, this company balloons into the largest global sugar business on earth.
And when it's domino, you're sure it's pure.
At the same time, US banks descend on the island, giving out very predatory loans and then foreclosing on land, gobbling it up and turning it into, you guessed it, sugar farms. Puerto Rico is slowly turning into a sugar island and becoming more.
Let me add some context into that again, Mr. Harris. So Puerto Rico itself was already involved in monoculture or monocultivos in the island before the United States came. It was just coffee in that moment. There was sugarcane, but there was sugarcane. There was other types of agriculture going on. The U.S. just explodes. It basically it just takes it to a whole different level that Spain never did. But in before an American interests came to the island, there was a lot of coffee plantations. There was monoculture already. So it wasn't something that the United States, it wasn't something new to the island.
More and more dependent on shipments from the mainland. The U.S.
Which, again, under Spain, it was the exact same situation. Puerto Rico was mostly dependent on shipments from the peninsula. So this isn't. It's you're just basically changing the area from where these shipments were mainly coming. So instead of coming from south of Spain, now they're coming from the eastern coast of the United States.
Enacts a new policy that says that anything going into Puerto Rico has to be transported by American ships
which, by the way, that's also called the Jones Act, not the 1917 Jones Act, which granted Puerto Ricans citizenship, which he'll mention later. This is the later Jones Act, or at least is part of that later Jones Act. So he's jumping. I think he's in this sense he's jumping from one year to another and then going back, and I get it. It's because you have to. It works better for the narrative, but it doesn't work in terms of the historical record. And as a historian, we have to also look at the historical record.
American crews. So of course this skyrockets the prices for locals, which is made worse by the fact that the US government had devalued and then outlawed the
This is something I want to add. When I first watched this video, this is something that really irked me, because from the beginning, from 1898 to more or less 1910, I think this is when this is happening. Yes, Puerto Rico had its own currency, but it was out of a necessity because the Spanish peso couldn't be used, and because of this weird limbo that the island was in, there wasn't a one-to-one exchange rate. Now, I'm not an expert in the history of the currency, so I may, if I'm making a mistake here, just leave it down in the comments and give me the references, and I'll be glad, and I'll gladly, accept that I'm wrong. But the Puerto Rican currency circulated for less than 10 years, and it really never was something that was thought to be of as permanent. It was just in that transition. It was just for the transition period between the Spanish Empire to the American Empire. And by the way, this transition wasn't just something that happened between 1898 and 1900. It takes a long time for this process to go, and it's called Americanización. It's Americanization, which he is going to mention also. Transculturation isn't just at the cultural level; it's also at the government and political level, and obviously economy. It's when you're mixing these economies, it takes a very, very short or very slow time for this to happen. Sometimes historical events happen very quick. Sometimes they take time, and mostly they do take time. It's processes that take a lot of time.
Local currency. So now every Puerto Rican lost almost half of their wealth overnight. And as a part of this push to lock Puerto Rico in as their colony, they forbid Spanish in schools and public institutions. And so
it's very interesting. Now, I'm not sure that they forbade it outright, but that policy didn't work. I think it was that was around the 1919, around that area, that time, if I'm remembering correctly. In fact, let's look it up. All right, so according to encyclopediapr.org, which is I recommend it. It's in Spanish, so if you know Spanish, you'll be able to read this. This says that it contradicts a little bit what Harris is saying. So, in 1900, under President William McKinley, the former Commissioner for Education, Martin G. Brumbaugh, actually created a plan to promote Spanish and English, so that kids would gradually learn English. The only reason that why the plan failed was because the kids. I'm sorry, not the kids. The only reason why the plan failed was because there was a scarcity of English-speaking teachers that could teach English. It's between the time period of 1904 and 1907 that what Mr. Harris is saying happens, which is under Roland P. Faulkner, and afterwards, that's just basically. So in 1916, there's a mixture. It's not just straightforward. For example, in 1916, Commissioner Paul G. Miller, he basically promoted that education would be in Spanish up until 4th grade, and afterwards kids would start learning. Everything would be in English, and they would, start learning in English. This was all the way up to 1934. Again, I'm translating from encyclopedia.pr.org loosely. I'm loosely translating this. Basically, up until 1934, Commissioner Jose Padín Rodriguez, he reinstated Spanish all the way to education, full monolingual education with English as part of the curriculum, but not in all of the grades. So again, it's not black and white. It's a very gray-ish topic when you look at the facts and you look at the different documentation.
So in this very short amount of time, the US turned Spain's former colony into this giant sugar farm, stripping down local identity and language and culture in the process.
Okay, so I wanted to mention this. There's this false theory. It is a historiographical theory that there was, that Americanization basically was trying to eliminate Puerto Rican culture, and that there was this active resistance against it. In reality, what really is happening is, as any transculturization process happens, there is a mixing of the two cultures. There is a give and take, right? And in this sense, Puerto Ricans basically took some of the American culture and rejected other areas. So yes, there's an active resistance or an active rejection of English as the only language, but there is an acceptance of other areas of the culture. So there is a negotiation between Puerto Ricans and the broader American cultures that are coming over during this entire process.
And locking the people under their control. And then Congress gives Puerto Ricans US citizenship, which conveniently was just in time for a giant
And he goes there. Oh God. Oh Johnny. Johnny, why? Why do you have to continue repeating things that have already been disproven? Okay, so here we go. According to my colleague, who is the expert in this, according to Dr. Harry Franke, who, by the way, he's a diasporican currently, and my colleague Harry Franke, Dr. Harry Franke, he wrote a book called Soldiers of the Nation, and it's available for purchase online. He was a professor at CUNY University, CUNY, or the City University of New York. He's right now in I think it's in Syracuse. Regardless of where he's currently at, he wrote the book Soldiers of the Nation, and in it he shows and he demonstrates that the U.S. citizenship wasn't imposed on Puerto Ricans so that they could go fight in World War I. To be honest, Puerto Rican regiments did not see combat in World War I. They were sent to Panama for guard duty. They weren't considered, they were basically discriminated against because they were not white. The same thing happened with the Harlem Hellfighters, which had to be transferred to the French army so that they could actually see combat in World War I. So the 65th Infantry Regiment, o la 65 de Infantería, Regimiento de 65 Infantería, did not have any. They did not see combat in World War I. So the idea that we were given citizenship because we were going to be the United States was going to use us as carne de cañón is totally false. The process starts in 1900 when Puerto Rican politicians start petitioning Congress to receive, so that Congress extends U.S. citizenship, because it was understood that if Puerto Ricans had, and Frankie, if you ever see this, correct me if I'm wrong, if Puerto Ricans were U.S. citizens, then the Constitution would follow the flag, and the Constitution would start applying fully to Puerto Rico. At this moment in time, Puerto Ricans are considered U.S. nationals, which is the reason why there's this entire thing with the insular cases and the ability for Congress to discriminate against the territory and the people of Puerto Rico because they were not citizens. That is the reason why in 1917 the Jones Act happens. It's because of a long debate and a long political process in Washington, which is one of the few times where the entirety of Puerto Rican political leadership is unified behind this. Obviously, there are primary documents of certain Puerto Rican leaders who are opposed, and are opposed not because they are opposed to U.S. citizenship. They are opposed to the whole point of, yes, we give you citizenship, but it's going to be a second-class citizenship. That's what they're opposed to. They're not opposed to Puerto Ricans being granted American citizenship.
Global war. So Puerto Rican men got sent to the front lines
They
to
were
fight
not
for the
they were not sent to the front lines. They were sent to Panama.
country that was in the process of pillaging their island. By 1922, a series of Supreme Court cases had solidified Puerto Rico as a, quote, unincorporated territory, which is just like word salad for the US Constitution doesn't fully apply here.
And that's where we're still today. We're unincorporated territory of the United States. Thank you.
I mean, think about it. Unincorporated territory, this intentionally contradictory jargon that came from
all of these judges, which, by the way, if I think one of them, I think this is from a later court, because the first insular case, I think Mr. Harris's team would have been better to use the first court, because the first court has former President Taft as the president of the court that was present over the first insular case, if I'm not mistaken, or I could be mistaken, but Taft and the members of that court were basically racists. You just have to read the insular cases, and you can go read the current citations of those cases in by SCOTUS today, and they're saying these are racist decisions that are still being upheld because the majority of the SCOTUS doesn't want to revoke them currently, at least. Hopefully in time it'll change, which is ironic, but what can we say?
These men hundreds of miles away, but honestly the message was very clear. Puerto Ricans did not look or sound enough like Americans to actually be a part of the United States.
Do remember that also at this time, between 1898 all the way to 1960s, the legal definition of separate but equal was in full effect in the United States. So the insular cases are also part of this separate but equal thinking of the early 20th century and late 19th century, post the Civil War and post Reconstruction.
By the 1930s, big banks owned 60% of these sugar farms, 80% of the tobacco farms, and 100% of the railroads and shipping facilities. At the same time, Puerto Ricans were being paid less than 4 cents an hour. If you put that into today's currency by inflation, that's like $1 an hour. Poverty and malnutrition start to grip this island. All the while, the US is turning the island into an essential military outpost.
Puerto Rico is already essentially a military outpost when the United States took it over, so it's not really surprising. Just look at the map. And heck, Mr. Harris will make the correct argument as to why Puerto Rico is a very important at least militarily speaking, strategic area for U.S. control, or for U.S. interests, to control U.S. interests in the Caribbean.
See how Puerto Rico juts out a little bit into the Caribbean? It served as a strategically positioned island to help protect trade routes.
Oh, and by the way, this is the reason why the United States wanted Puerto Rico in the first place. So if you look at Commodore Alfred Mahan's book, which is called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, you're going to find that he mentions Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Panama Canal. And the reason why the United States had to control these strategic points, which also included Cuba, by the way, for coal ships, because ships ran on coal, back in the early 20th century. So Puerto Rico was seen as a place where you could set up a military outpost and have ships refuel coal. So this isn't surprising. It's basically a reason. It's all from Mayhem.
And a place where you could refuel ships. Over time, more and more military bases and installations start to pop up on this island. The US would go on to test thousands of bombs in Puerto Rico, leaving behind one of the most hazardous waste sites in the United States.
I find it funny that he jumps from the early 20th century to what? Halfway through the 20th century in a jiffy. And, because now we're talking about Vieques. By the way, I have a great podcast episode for your Spanish speakers. I have a great podcast episode in regards to Vieques. And obviously Culebra also. Hey, wait, funny enough. Let's go back. Let me check that. Now that I'm thinking about it. Yeah, he doesn't even mention Culebra. I mean, if you're going to mention Vieques, Johnny, you could at least mention that Culebra was also bombed to submission. It actually was the first firing range. They moved it from Culebra to Vieques afterwards. Get your facts straight, Mr. Harris.
Thousands of bombs in Puerto Rico, leaving behind one of the most hazardous waste sites in the United States. And by the middle of the 1900s, Puerto Rico really starts to mirror what the US envisioned. Puerto Rico, the sugar metropolis. Puerto Rico, the land of low wages and abundant laborers.
You know what's interesting? It's if you look at China today, right? If we're gonna make a very comparisons, this is basically the model that China is following. They pay very poor to their very few good wages to their workers, which is the reason why American companies are going to China and abroad to be able to pay lower wages. So, it's a pattern in history.
Puerto Rico, the irreplaceable military outpost. The empire that billed themselves as the liberators from Spain is now an overlord, and the locals start fighting back.
And this is where I have a lot of thoughts, but I'll get to it. I'll get to why.
The fight is led by this guy, Pedro Albizu Campo.
See, first, why are we jumping to Albizu? It's like he's not the originator of the independence movement. The independence movement, you could have. Okay, so I mean, I'm not a pro-independence adherent, so this shouldn't bother me, but it does, because Albizu is not the father of independence in Puerto Rico. Okay, it's Jose de Diego. It's all these other proponents of independence that were that start building after it was made obvious by the insular cases that the United States would not annex Puerto Rico in the sense of make it a state immediately after taking over or conquering the island. So many of these adherents or these people that were believed in the sovereignty of Puerto Rico, they decided they went into the Union Party, which was basically which ran elections against the Republican Party.
He's this poor kid who ends up going to Harvard. He graduates valedictorian from Harvard Law School. He serves the US in World War I and even helps draft Ireland's independence constitution. Like, the guy's kind of a superstar. Ultimately, he returns to his hometown to attempt the impossible, Puerto Rican independence. But soon, Campos would find himself bouncing in and out of prison for 25 years.
Cuando los adultos de la patria tienen que salir despavoridos de sus lares, no tienen siquiera salida a países extranjeros distintos del poder enemigo que nos ofusca. Tienen que ir a Estados Unidos a ser los esclavos de los poderes económicos de los tiranos en nuestra patria.
Things haven't.
You know, you gotta hand it to Alviso. At least he was a great orator. There were a lot of great orators in history with very bad ideas too. And I'm not saying Puerto Rican independence is bad. Let me clarify that for y'all that may be taking things out of context. But I'll explain this. I'll explain what I mean in upcoming comments.
Quite escalated. This movement is just starting. Campos comes back to Puerto Rico with the goal of total separation from the United States, and people join him. A lot of people, just everyday, ordinary Puerto Ricans who are fed up with being exploited. They join them, they organize, and they call themselves the Nationalists.
There we go. Okay, one, the Partido Nacionalista was not founded by Alviso Campos. He joined it and then he became its leader, but it wasn't founded by Alviso. According to, let's see if this has a. Okay, so citing this book called Brevario sobre la historia de Ponce y sus principales lugares de interés by Neisa Rodríguez Deines, Rafael Torres Torres, and Carlos Anero Pérez. The origins of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party date to 1917 when a group of Union Party members, remember that I mentioned, dissatisfied with the attitude of the Union Party of Puerto Rico towards granting of U.S. citizenship, formed the Asociación Nacionalista de Ponce, Ponce Nationalist Association. Among its founders were Dr. Guillermo Salazar, Rafael Matos Berniez, J.A. González, and Julio César Fernández. These men also founded the newspaper El Nacionalista. The Puerto Rican Nationalist Party was formed as a direct response to the American colonial government in 1919. Jose Cola and Cuchi, a member of the Union Party, felt that the Union Party was not doing enough for the cause of Puerto Rican independence. Col y Cuchi and some followers left to form the Nationalist Association of Puerto Rico in San Juan. Under Col and Cuchi's presidency, the party convinced the Puerto Rican Legislative Assembly to approve an act that would permit the transfer of the remains of the Puerto Rican patriot Ramon Emeterio Betances from Paris, France to Puerto Rico. So, as you can see, Campos is not the founder of the Nationalist Party, as would Mr. Harris wants us to believe. He was just one of the main figures, or let's just say the main figure that pushed the popularity of this party and its growth. It was at a time, if I'm remembering correctly, at a time there was 40% of Puerto Ricans wanted independence and adhered to the Nationalist Party. So it was a 40% voter base, at least while they participated. And to be clear, most nationalists did not participate in the elections. So that's why the elections results would not, they did not reflect the sentiments of independence at that time.
They run for office, they go on strike, and they fight back against this superpower that has been exploiting them. Momentum begins to pick up. And then the dominoes really start to fall. There was this American doctor. His name is Cornelius Rhodes, and he went to Puerto Rico saying he's gonna do like health research or something. We know what he really was doing and thinking because he wrote this letter. Let me read it to you. He writes that Puerto Ricans are, quote, beyond doubt the dirtiest, laziest, and most degenerate and thievish race of men ever to have inhabited this sphere. And he goes on to say that it makes him sick to, quote, inhabit the same island with them. But he doesn't stop there. He says that Puerto Ricans need, quote, something to totally exterminate the entire population. And then he admits to a crime. He says, I have done my best to further the process of their extermination by killing off 8 and transplanting cancer into several more.
I have 2 thoughts on this. Well, 3 thoughts. Actually, the first thought is the same thought that I had when my bachelor's degree, when I heard about this story. Shout out to Professor Hernandez in UPR Mayagüez. This was a horrifying human being. A person that was beyond just a racist. If we were to take the definition of a serial killer or a mass murderer, Cornelius Rhodes would fit it perfectly. The guy was a sociopath or a psychopath. It takes somebody a lot to kill 8 people. That is the definition of a serial killer. So, for me, it wouldn't surprise me if Cornelius Rhodes could be considered. Again, I'm not an expert in that subject, so somebody would have to look at it, post-mortem. But Cornelius Rhodes was just a horrifying human being. The second thing is, let's put this into a little bit of a perspective. This is before the Second World War. And social Darwinism is a very, very interesting thing. Because this is basically eugenics. Yeah. What Cornelius Rhodes was... and not only Cornelius Rhodes, but a lot of American scientists and European scientists advocated was eugenics. And if I recently saw another YouTube video about this topic recently, and I'll just put it into the description as a link, as a reference. I don't think I'm not sure if it was Johnny Harris, but or it was somebody else. But they talked about the hypocrisy of the Allies, that they condemned Germany for being they outright, rightly so, for their crimes against humanity. But eugenics was still something that was in that moment. It was genuine science. Today it's junk science. We know that a person like Cornelius Rhodes would be just laughed out of academia and normal society anywhere in the West. So those are my thoughts regarding that.
I mean, this is bad.
Yes,
it is bad. It's really bad. But horrendous. For a lot of Puerto Ricans, this wasn't surprising. So the staff at the hospital find this letter and they send it around to everyone. And it goes out and it goes viral. And nothing happens to this guy who has admitted to murdering a bunch of Puerto Ricans. Actually, something does happen. He gets on the front cover of Time magazine. To the nationalists, this letter confirms something that...
Again, eugenics was seen as something valuable in research, and still horrendous. I mean, eugenics is the reason why we can talk about 8 million Jews and undesirables, as they were called in Germany, were mass murdered. Eugenics is the reason why Hitler was even a thing. Or part of the reason, not just the reason, but part of the reasons.
They already knew it. It actually wasn't that surprising. There was an awareness that, yes, America loves Puerto Rico for their soil and their labor and their strategic location, but hates them as people.
Was that a generalized thing, though? Because that argument is still used today, and if you talk to everyday general Americans, they fall in one of three groups. Either they have no idea where Puerto Ricans are. Two, they're just racist individuals that are mainly aligned with conservatives and the Republican Party, or the third group, which is normal human beings and who really don't care about the color of the skin, but the content of somebody's character.
So after this letter, the movement explodes.
The movement doesn't just explode because of the letter. There's a whole other things. There's a whole bunch of events that are happening during this time. And it's not just the letter. It's everything. It's bad. It's, everything he has explained by now. It's, bad working conditions. The whole point of Puerto Rico being separate but equal, and so forth and so forth. It's not just the letter. And the letter the letter just comes and it just adds more fuel to the fire.
It gets to the point where the US and their puppet government on.
By the way, those here, let me show you. This footage isn't from Alvisu's time. This footage, if I'm not mistaken, is probably later on during the 50s. I mean, yeah, Alviso was alive during that time period. But it's not early. So it's not when the Nationalist Party is coming up. But I know, like I said, he jumps from time frame to time frame, and it's sometimes difficult to follow it through in a logical timeline. So I just wanted to point that little fact out.
It gets to the point where the US and their puppet government on the island can no longer ignore this movement. Soon, a bunch of new officers are hired and trained and armed with machine guns and tear gas. But the Nationalists keep fighting. Then, in 1935, police kill 4 Nationalists at a university event. The Nationalists retaliate by killing the police chief. Then, without trial, the police execute his killer and arrest Campos, the leader of the movement, for plotting to overthrow the government.
See, that's why I'm saying that he jumps from time frame to time frame, because this is before the 50s. This is around I think it's 30s. All this is happening during the 30s. Let me get that. Let me get that fact correct. See, what he's talking about is October 24, 1935, confrontation with police at the University of Puerto Rico. Campos and Piedra resulted in the deaths of 4 national partisans and 1 policeman. This is the La Masacre de Piedras, Rio Piedras massacre. After that, this and other events led to the party to announce on December 12, 1935, a boycott of all elections held while Puerto Rico remained part of the United States. On February 23, 1936, in San Juan, 2 nationalists assassinated the insular police chief and ex-U.S. Marine officer Francis Riggs. The nationalist perpetrators, Hiram Rosado and Nieves Bouchamp, were arrested, transported to police headquarters, and killed within hours without trial. So he's talking about events in the 30s, but the footage is from the 50s. Just to be clear.
Campos is given this rigged trial with a jury made up mostly of mainland Americans, and he gets sentenced to prison for 10 years. A few months later, people are out peacefully protesting on Palm Sunday, and the police start shooting into the crowd. Men, women, children, and elders are all clubbed and beaten to death and shot in the back as they run away.
Yes, and there is evidence that there was none of the nationalists were armed. They were using wooden toy guns, marching with wooden toy guns. And this is the reason why I said we would talk about this later. He doesn't mention it, but the nationalists used a very unique set of colors. They used black and white, and they were called the Cadetes de la Nación, if I'm not mistaken. It's called, the Cadets of the Republic. And if you read Campos and you listen to a lot of his speeches, Campos wasn't a socialist. Actually, he was a ardent anti-communist. I think Luis Muñoz Marin could have been seen more as a socialist. I wanted to call it communism, but more of a socialist. And there's also there's an amendment to the or actually a point or an article of the Puerto Rican constitution that is eliminated by Congress because it was too communist, which was labor rights. I think it was Article 17 or Article 18 if I'm not mistaken. But Campos was very conservative. He was more akin to the nationalism that was in Spain at this time. We're talking about Franco and that type of fascism. He wasn't. It's really hard to come out and say that Campos was a fascist, because again, they never attained power, so we don't know what he would have done. But he had very proto-fascist ideas. There's the xenophobia there was on point, which is part of fascist ideology of, Puerto Ricans are the better race, and the more, we were being in that part rightly so, governed by these governments that are being abusive and all that type. But it was more of, we're better. It wasn't about patriotism. It was a nationalism, which is, go figure, called Nationalist Party. So this is why I it's, for me, it's not as black and white as you can see the cadete. This is actually a cadet. They blurred it out for obvious reasons, but he has a black shirt and white pants. That's the uniform that they would use. They were called black shirts, which is also the term that the fascists in Italy would also use. Yes, in Italy and in Spain.
19 are killed and over 100 are wounded, but it still doesn't put down the movement. The violence only pours fuel on the fire. Back in Washington, D.C., they're starting to get worried that this independence movement is just going to keep building. And they don't want to give...
You know what's funny? Again, we're talking about the 30s, and then we jump, as I said, we go from 20s, and then we jump back to the 50s, to the 60s, and whatnot. This is a poster for the plebiscite, the first plebiscite in 1967, that is held after Puerto Rico, after the plebiscite or the referendum to approve or not the Constitution of 1952, which is what names Puerto Rico as the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. It's just another name for the territory of Puerto Rico.
give up their island in the Caribbean. There's still plenty of money to be made off of Puerto Rican soil and labor, not to mention the military bases that they had there. So they turned to an extreme measure, something that, as I learned about and as we reported on, has been blowing my mind in a way that I study this stuff a lot. I look at the behavior of empires. I look at how they control people. I've never seen this before. It starts with FBI agents who come to the island to work with the police of Puerto Rico. They have one simple mission: to spy on anyone who they deem politically subversive and to sabotage them, and thus sabotage the independence movement. So they spy on everyone. They spy on the nationalists who are part of the movement, but also their friends, their partners, their sexual partners, their business colleagues, their children. They track down criminal records and mistresses and debtors and creditors and photos and license plate numbers, school transcripts, and even the guest list to weddings. Like, they got really detailed. They started listening in on phone calls and intercepting letters. Everything was fair game. The idea was to create panopticon, this idea that they're always watching. They also started to cultivate relationships with a network of informers. Often the victim's family or friends or neighbors would get sucked into this state spying apparatus. The FBI uses payments and coercion and manipulation, which often forces people to turn on each other, causing divorce and broken friendship and fractured communities. Much of this was done undercover. Like, these FBI agents would just be dressed in normal clothes, but would be constantly surveilling the people around them. Oh, and we know about this because
They wrote it
they
down.
documented everything.
Carpetas. This is, by the way, for those of you wondering, this is where the term carpeteo comes from. I left it run a little while because I wanted. He actually does a pretty good job explaining what the carpetas were, what was done under carpeteo. And I actually find it interesting that considering the sources that he's or the way that he's presented this, that they didn't mention the flag of Puerto Rico, which would have been another whole different rant. But he doesn't mention it, which is good, because that has nothing to do. The carpetas technically did not have to do with the gag laws, and the gag laws had nothing to do with the flags, anyways. So that's fine. I think he did a pretty good job in explaining it.
If you were a person of interest, you probably had a file. All of these files, they're called the carpetas. Our story producer, Rafaela, went to San Juan to see the carpetas firsthand.
So I'm at the General Archive building in San Juan in Puerto Rico to see these secret surveillance documents that were collected on thousands of Puerto Ricans over so many decades.
After weeks of work, I finally got to look at las carpetas to see what was actually in these files.
Yeah,
and
you
it's
can go
kind of
today.
creepy, I have to say. You see specific times and dates and details from meetups, detailed descriptions of the locations where people are just meeting, all of the names of people involved, these subgroups that were potentially supporters of the independence movement. You get these highly detailed physical.
You know what's funny? Go back. Okay, so the miembros del. This, what he means, this is the Socialist Party of Puerto Rico, the Liberal Socialist Party. Oh my goodness, this is. Oh, okay, so yeah, PNP is Partido Nacionalista Puertorriqueño. The Puerto Rico Socialist Party, that PSP right there. The PSP up until the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, 60s. Yeah, this could. I would need to look at the correct data, but I find it hilarious that they added the PSP, Partido Socialista, because the Partido Socialista, or the Socialist Party of Puerto Rico, while it was while it had an electoral presence, was actually pro statehood. So it wasn't. I just caught it now, because the first time around I didn't caught it, but now I did. I'm like, wait a minute.
that were potentially supporters of the independence movement. You get these highly detailed physical descriptions of the people.
Go back. I think PRD. Wait, let's see.
Supporters of.
Yeah. PRD, I think it's Partido Revolucionario Dominicano. Wow, they were. This is interesting. I really need to go look at these carpetas. I haven't done it. But you know what he's showing. They they were also they're also persecuting people allying with the Revolutionary Party of the Dominican Republic. Now that's very, very interesting.
The independence movement. You get these highly detailed physical descriptions of the people that they were tracking, their occupation, the model of their car, their license plate number, and all of their moves, all of their activities, what they were doing, who they were supporting. And even for those who moved away from Puerto Rico, they continued to track them and knew exactly what apartment they lived in the Bronx. They speculated about their nationalistic tendencies. And then you see these interviews that agents were having with people close to the target, where their personal beliefs are revealed, like one who thought that Puerto Rico would be repaired with socialism and independence. You can see a source telling these agents that they're afraid.
I'm sorry, I had to laugh because, yeah, socialism has never fixed anything. Yes. It's just tough. It's tough to watch it. So I'm gonna leave it here because this is it's getting long. If people want, I can do the other half. If people are interested in it, I'll do the other half. But as I said, this is Dr. Edwin Jusino Aldarondo. Thank you all for watching. Subscribe to my channel. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter and Threads. Now we have Threads at ERJ Jusino A. And if you speak Spanish and understand Spanish, you can also follow in Spotify Historiando. You can listen to my podcast where I have dialogues with colleagues and people. And historical actors that are still alive, and we do exercises of oral history. Till the next time, see ya.